Hi, this is Dr. Stabio again, and this week we're going to be talking about the chief concern of a gait disturbance. And so I want to zoom out a little bit and talk more big picture about the brain as a prediction analysis machine. What the brain is doing is integrating information from the environment. So there is this input, which is the sensory information from the environment, from primarily our sense organs and our sense of touch. Remember that sensation is a general term for all the input that comes in. So we take the sensation as our input, and then that produces an output, which is a behavior. It can be either motor or emotional. This week, we're talking primarily about the motor systems, but in mind and behavior course, you'll be talking more about some of the emotional outputs of behavior. What does the brain do? The brain does this integration. It's taking all the information from the sensory input, it's integrating it and combining it with memory, past experience, learning, and it's making a prediction. What should I do? And that prediction ultimately ends with a motor output or a behavioral, emotional output. Really, this is an overarching theme throughout the next several weeks, where we focus on the motor systems this week. We talk more about pain in week 3. We talk about the special senses in week 4. As we proceed in this week and talk about motor systems, I don't want you to ignore the sensory information input. And that sensory information input, particularly that of the somatosensory system, the sense of touch and proprioception, is what I want to focus on in this video. And that is because your patient may express problems with the sense of touch, but it could be a loss of sensation, like, doctor, I don't feel anything, like numbness, or it should be sensations that shouldn't be there, like I have this extra tingling in my hand, or I have pain, right? What does that sensation really mean? Well, in terms of the way the nervous system is set up, it's important to remember that there are 2 divisions of somatosensation. Remember, somato means touch of the body. So we're talking about touch from skin, sensations from skin, and sensations from muscle spindles. So there are 2 divisions of somatosensation that process the sense of touch in 2 different pathways. So let's go through this through a case. A 50-year-old man presents with paresthesia in both legs. He has normal gait and no motor deficits. He can still feel pain and temperature. Neurologic exam demonstrates reduced proprioception and 2-point discrimination, and reduced 2-point discrimination in both legs. All right, what on earth is going on? So far, it sounds like this is a problem with some sort of touch. There's a sensory information problem, right? We haven't done the full neurologic exam, but I don't mention anything about the special senses. I also don't mention anything about the motor function, but we'll get to that. Let's dissect this a little bit. So first of all, what is paresthesia? We need to know, why are pain and temperature okay? Aren't they somatosensory too? What's proprioception, and who cares? Why do we need to check this? And what's 2-point discrimination? And where's the lesion? How do we treat it? Let's go through these questions one by one. So what is paresthesia? So this is the numb and tingly feeling. You've probably had it when your foot falls asleep or you laying down on your arm a funny way. It's often benign or due to a peripheral compression. But in the case of neurologic disorders, it can mean more. So what about, why are pain and temperature okay in this patient? Well, that's, as I mentioned before, and as you learned in the previous video, there are 2 different somatosensory pathways. There's the DCML, which is the fine touch, vibration, pressure, and proprioception. DCML stands for dorsal column medial lemniscus. And there's the spinothalamic pathway. This is also called the anterior lateral system because it's located along the anterior lateral aspect of the spinal cord. This carries pain and temperature information up to the brain. Right? They travel together in the peripheral nerve, and they travel together in the cerebrum. But in the spinal cord and brainstem, they're traveling separately. And this happens to be a really important neuroanatomical point that helps you with lesion localization. Because if you see a patient with loss of one of them and not the other, it's most likely a spinal cord problem. They also have different receptors, fiber types, and conduction velocities. So let's talk about this. We're going to talk about this more in week 3. So there are different fiber types. These are single axons, right? There's A alpha, A beta, A delta, and C fibers. In the dorsal column medial lemniscus system, this sensation is carried by A alpha or A beta fibers. These are the largest diameter fibers. They have the highest speed, up to 200 miles per hour. They can conduct action potentials. The fastest are the proprioceptors of skeletal muscles, and then there's the mechanoreceptors in the skin. The spinothalamic pathway has thinner fibers that are either non-myelinated or just lightly myelinated, as in the case of A delta. These go slower at around 20 miles per hour. You can see that they're smaller diameter, they have a little bit slower speed, and they're primarily for pain, temperature, or even itch. And so you've experienced these different fibers when you've fallen down or stubbed your toe, or initially you have a very sharp, fast, sharp pain, like when you stub your toe. That's coming from the A delta fibers that are conducting the pain more quickly. And then over time, there's that slow, dull, throbbing pain. That's going to be from the C fibers. The position sense of where your arm was when it fell, that's not sense of pain, that's position sense. That's going to be from the A alpha fibers. And this just demonstrates the histology of a peripheral nerve. And I want to show you that these different types of fibers are all bundled together. This is a cross-sectional view, and this is a longitudinal view. You can look at this more closely in Lee's histology. So you'll find multiple fiber types in the same nerve. And you'll learn the names of these somatosensory receptors when you get into your MSI course. But this is not an LO. I just want you to know they exist. You'll learn more about these. But in the skin, you have all these different types of specialized receptors that will take the mechanical pressure or vibration and convert that into an action potential. You'll learn about the Merkel receptor, the free nerve ending, hair receptor, so on and so forth that are found in the skin. But again, remember, you have different specialized receptors for doing different types of touch. We talked about proprioception, and this is often overlooked and ignored, but it is one of the most important types of touch. It's also called kinesthesia. It tells the location and movement of all the parts of the body. It will tell you about your joint position and movement when your eyes are closed. You know where your arms are. You know where your legs are. You know what position they're in. And it'll also tell about the strength of a muscle contraction. That's because there's these specialized mechanoreceptors in the muscle themselves called the muscle spindle that will tell the length of the muscle, as well as the Golgi tendon organ. These two together are proprioceptors. Who cares, right? Well, proprioception is very important, and it's this information from receptors in the joints and in the muscles will combine with information in the eyes that tell us visually where our body is, as well as information about head position that's sensed by your vestibular organs in the inner ear. This will tell about rotation, acceleration, and position. The brain receives, interprets this information from proprioceptors, from eyes, and from vestibular organs to give information about your body's position in space in order to properly coordinate the motor output. This is a really neat link that talks about proprioception from the Genetic Science Learning Center at Utah. So we've answered these questions. What's paresthesia? It's that numbing, tingling sensation. Why and temperature are okay? Aren't they somatosensory? Yes, but they're in different pathways. So this suggests that the pain and temperature pathway is okay, and it must be the DCML pathway containing fine touch, right? And actually the next sentence confirms that because there's reduced proprioception and there's reduced two-point discrimination. Wait a minute. What's two-point discrimination? Well, we're going to do this in lab on Thursday. Two-point discrimination is a fine touch measurement. It's the minimum distance at which a person can discriminate 2 points versus 1 point on the skin when their eyes are closed. You'll test these on each other voluntarily. You don't have to participate, but if you want to, it's a really interesting demonstration. And you will map out 2-point discrimination values in different somatosensory receptive fields. And this relates to the receptive field size, because if the receptive field size are very small, then you'll have 2 neurons innervating each of these 2 different spots, and your brain will interpret those as 2 spots. But if the receptive field size enlarges, and say this is the entire receptive field and there's only 1 neuron, it doesn't matter that there's 2 points. Your brain will get action potentials through 1 neuron in that area of skin and will interpret that as 1 point. Reduced or poor 2-point discrimination means the patient has a reduced or poor sensitivity to fine touch, and that can tell you that there's a problem with the DCML pathway. And we'll get to a case related to this in the lab on Thursday afternoon. So back to 2-point discrimination, what areas of the body have the highest sensitivity to fine touch? Well, remember, we talked about this in week 1 when we talked about the homunculus. The homunculus is a map, a cartoon map, where the surface area of the different parts of body on the homunculus, the little cartoon, represent the amount of surface area dedicated to that body part on the somatosensory cortex. And we have a lot of somatosensory cortex dedicated to our hands, our tongue, our lips, and our face, which is just this entire lateral aspect of the parietal lobe. And so these are going to be the areas with the finest two-point discrimination and the highest sensitivity to touch and the smallest receptive fields. It's kind of like the tinier the pixels and the more you have, the higher the resolution. It's the same thing. You have tiny little receptive fields on your skin, innervated by hundreds of millions of neurons that are going to a large amount of surface area for processing on the brain. Okay, so that leads us to the last question. Where's the lesion and how do we treat it? Well, we have to go back to the previous video and think about those two pathways. Most likely, it's not somatosensory cortex, because somatosensory cortex would lead to both a loss of pain and temperature and fine touch, vibration, proprioception, because those two pathways are traveling together and are being processed together in the somatosensory cortex. So it's most likely not there. It's also most likely not the thalamus, although it could be if it was the internal capsule near the thalamus. We'll talk about that in the advanced course. All right, it's also not going to be a peripheral nerve, because if you cut out, for example, the whole dorsal root, you would again have loss of pain in red, two-point discrimination, proprioception, which is in green. These pathways are traveling together here in the dorsal root, and they're traveling together in the peripheral nerve. So where do they start to separate? Where's an opportunity? They separate in the spinal cord, because the spinothalamic pathway crosses. The fine touch proprioception pathway does not cross until it gets up to the brainstem. And so most likely, this is going to be a problem with the spinal cord. Now, we'll figure out exactly where it is in our cases on Thursday. You can just be thinking about it for now. And the last question, because we're talking about gait disturbances this week, do you think this patient would have any difficulty with gait, right? They don't have paralysis. They don't have a damage to the corticospinal tract. But what is the role of proprioception for motor function? I'm not going to answer this question. We're going to talk about it this week in the Chief Concern and in the Intro to Motor Systems. I'll see you then.